and welcome back to this episode of the book club Commune. Today we're going to be getting into chapter 5, which is all about Harry Haywood and his experiences while in Russia in the Soviet Union, being taught at the school in the East named for Stalin. It's really interesting. I hope you enjoy it. So, here is chapter 5. Chapter 5. A Student in Moscow. Otto's delegation of black students to the Soviet Union caused quite a stir in the States. The FBI kept an eye on their activities, and in the late summer of 1925, their departure was sensationalized in the New York Times. The article attributed a statement to Lovett Fort Whiteman, the fact that he had sent 10 blacks to the Soviet Union to study Bolshevism and prepare for careers in the communist diplomatic service. The article concluded with a statement calling for action against such subversive activity. At the time, we felt that any black applying for a passport would be subjected to close scrutiny. Therefore, when I learned that I too would soon be studying in Moscow, I applied for the first names of my mother, Harriet, and father, Haywood. This name was to stick with me for the rest of my life. Several weeks later, I received my passport. I heard the FBI had been making inquiries about me. By that time, I had become known as one of the founders of the ANLC. Therefore, as the time for my departure drew near, I hid out at the home of comrades on Chicago's west sides until arrangements were made. I went to the national office of the Communist Party, then in Chicago, and was informed by Ruthenberg or Lovestone that I should get ready to leave. Political credentials typed on silk were sewn into the lining of my coat sleeve. In order to avoid getting to the port of New York, I left by the way of Canada. In the manner of the old Underground Railroad, I was passed from one set of comrades to the next. From Detroit, Rudy Baker, the district organizer, forwarded me to the Canadian Party headquarters in Toronto, where Jim MacDonald and Tim Buck were in charge. They sent me to Montreal, where comrades housed me and booked a passage for me to Hamburg, Germany. Boarding ship in Quebec in the late spring of 1926, I sailed on the Canadian Pacific liner, the old Empress of Scotland. From Hamburg, I took a train to Berlin, arriving on Saturday afternoon. I had the address of Hazel Harrison, the wife of a Chicago friend of mine, who was a concert pianist, studying in Berlin, where she had her professional debut. Years later, she was to head the music department at Howard University. At that time, she was living at a boarding house near Kurfürstendamm, and I stopped there for the remainder of the weekend. This was the first time I had been in Berlin. Germany was then emerging from the post-war crisis, during which currency inflation had reached astronomical heights, resulting in the virtual expropriation of a large section of the middle class. It was common to see shabbily dressed men still trying to keep up appearances by wearing starched white collars under their patched clothing. The owners of the boarding house, 2 middle-aged widows who were friends of Hazel's, showed me a trunk filled with paper notes, old German marks, which were now worthless. This had probably represented a life's savings. Hazel and her 2 friends had took me out to the Tiergarten, the famous Berlin Zoo. I was soon attracted to the sight of 3 lion cubs that had been mothered by a German police dog. The cubs were getting big, and it was clear that the mother was no longer able to control them. We watched for some time, fascinated. I turned around and realized there was a crowd around us. At first I thought they were looking at the cubs, but then it became clear that Hazel and I were the center of attention. Blacks were rare in Berlin in those days, only about half a dozen or so, mostly from former German colonies in the Cameroons. Monday morning I took a cab to the headquarters of the German Party at Karl Marx's house on Rosenthalerstrasse. It was a dour, fortress-like structure, with high walls surrounding the main building, which was set in the middle. I entered into the anteroom, just inside the walls, in which there were a number of sturdy-looking young men lounging around. When I came in, they jumped up and stood eyeing me suspiciously. They were unarmed, but I knew their weapons were within arm's reach. This was a symbol of the times, for it was not long after the beer hall push of Hitler's brown shirts in Munich, and the battle for the streets of Berlin had already begun. I presented my credentials to a man named Walters, who was undoubtedly the head of security. It was on this occasion that I first met Ernest Thalmann, a former Hamburg longshoreman and then leader of the German Communist Party. He was passing through the gate and Walters stopped him and introduced us. Thalmann spoke fairly good English, probably acquired in his work as a seaman, and we chatted for a while. He asked after Father, Ruthenberg, and others. Wishing me good luck, he passed on his way. Walters gave me some spending money and arranged for me to stay with some German comrades, a young couple who had an elaborate apartment. The husband ran a haberdashery store on the Friedrichstrasse and was a commander in the Rotfront, the Red Front, the paramilitary organization with which the communists had organized for defense of workers against the fascists. One day while walking down the Kurfürstendamm, I saw a cabaret billboard advertising the black jazz band of Leyland and Drayton and their Charleston dancers. It was a well-known band back in the States. I had little money, but I couldn't resist the temptation to stop in and hear them. I sat down at the table and ordered a beer. To my dismay, the waiter said they didn't sell beer, just wine, so I took the wine card and chose the cheapest bottle I could find. A number of band members and dancers came over to my table and asked where I was going. I told them I was a student going to Moscow. They said they had just returned from a 6-month tour in Russia. They were the first black jazz group that had gone to the Soviet Union. I had asked if they had met Otto and other black students there. Yes, they had met them all, and they all had a good time together, so we sat down to exchange news. As we talked, I began to worry about the bill, and said I was low on money. "Oh, don't worry about that," someone said, and ordered more wine. But when it came time to pay for the drinks, I got stuck with the whole tab and had to walk several miles across town to get home. After a month in Berlin, my visa came through. I was on my way to Stettin, a city in the Baltic Sea, which bordered Poland, and where I boarded a small Soviet ship. After 3 days of the roughest seas I've ever experienced, we landed in Leningrad. It was April 1926, and we were already in the season of the White Nights, when daylight lasted late into the evening. As we entered the Gulf of Finland the following morning, we passed the naval fortress of Kronstadt, about 20 miles out from Leningrad, the site of the anti-Soviet mutiny of 1920. The ship had finally docked in Leningrad. Upon landing, I presented my visa and passport to the authorities. Addressing me in English, a man in civilian dress said, "Oh, you're going to the Comintern school in Moscow?" "Yes," I replied. He immediately took me in charge and got my baggage through customs. I assumed he was a member of the security police. We left the customs building and got onto an old beat-up Packard. As we drove away from the docks, he informed me that the Moscow train would not leave until 8 that evening. He put me up in a hotel where I could rest and go out and see the city. Leningrad, or St. Petersburg, was built by Tsar Peter the Great in the 16th century and was now renamed for the architect of the new socialist society. As I walked down the now famous Nevsky Prospect, I thought of John Reed's 10 Days That Shook the World, trying to recapture some of the dramatic scenes in the classic. I passed the Peter and Paul Fortress and then the Winter Palace, home of the Tsars and now a museum of the people. Once the storm of the Winter Palace in 1917 had been a crucial event in the taking of St. Petersburg by the Bolsheviks. The people I saw passing me in the street were plainly dressed. Many men wore the traditional ropcheka and high boots. Others were in European dress. Most people were dressed neatly, though shabbily, and all appeared to be well fed. They were bright and cheerful. It seemed they went about with a purpose, a sharp contrast to the atmosphere of hopelessness that had pervaded Berlin. People in Leningrad looked at me, and I looked at them. By this time, I had become used to being stared at and took it as a friendly curiosity. After all, a black man was seldom seen in these parts. After several hours, I returned to my hotel. My friend from the security police showed up promptly at 7 with my train ticket and took me to the station to put me on a train to Moscow. Filled with excitement and anticipation, I got little sleep on the train and awoke early to see the Russian landscape flowing by my window. Pine forests, groves of birch trees, and swamps. I was in the midst of the great Russian steppes. When we had arrived in Moscow at Yaroslavsky Station, some of my traveling companions hailed a droshky and told the driver to take me to the Comintern. Moscow at last. We drove from the station into the vast sprawling city, once the capital of the old Russia and now of the new. It was a bright, sunny morning, and the sun glistened off the golden church domes of the City of 1,000 Churches. It seemed a maze of narrow cobblestone streets, intersected by broad boulevards. While Leningrad had been a distinctly European city, Moscow seemed a mixture of Asiatic and the European. A bizarre and strange combination to me, but a cheerful one. Moscow was more Russian than the cosmopolitan Leningrad. Crowds swarmed the streets in many different styles of dress. We arrived at the Commune, which was housed in an old 18th century structure on Ulista Commune, near the Kremlin, across the square from the Staraya Konyushnya, the old stables of the Tsar. I paid the driver and entered the building. The guard at the door checked my credentials and directed me upstairs to a small office on the 3rd floor. After producing my bona fides, I was told to take a seat, to wait for my comrades, who would soon be coming for me. About half an hour later, Otto and another black man entered the room. I was overjoyed at the sight of him and his friend, who turned out to be a fellow student, Harold Williams. We embraced Russian style, and I began to feel more at home in this strange land. Otto asked about the family. An expression of sadness crossed his face, however, when I asked him about the rest of the black students. He informed me of Jane Golden's serious illness. She was at that moment in a uremic coma from a kidney ailment and was not expected to live. Her husband was at her side at the hospital. Though both were from Chicago, I had not met them before. The situation had saddened the whole black student body, and for that matter, the whole school. In the course of her brief sojourn, Jane had become very popular. Otto described her in glowing terms, a real morale booster, whose spirit had helped all of them through the period of initial adjustment. I was impressed. Here was a black woman, not a member of the Communist Party, who had so easily become accustomed to the new Soviet socialist society. It seemed to me that there must be thousands of black women like her in the U.S. After we had greeted each other, we caught a droshky over to the school in order that I might register officially. In the course of the ride, the driver lashed his horse and cursed at him. I asked Otto what he was saying, and he gave a running translation. "Get up there, you son of a bitch. I feed you oats, while myself eat black bread. Your sire was no good, you bastard. Your mama was no good, too." This verbal and physical abuse, Otto told me, was typical of most Russian droshky drivers. We finally arrived at the school administration, which was housed in another old 17th century structure built before the Revolution. It had been a finishing school for daughters of the aristocracy. Before that, it had been a boys' school where, rumor had it, the great Pushkin had studied. Otto introduced me to the university rector with what sounded to my untrained ear like fluent Russian. We then went to the office of the chancellor, where I was duly registered. I was now a student at the Universitet Jayadashashilazaka Vostoka Imen Stalina, the University of the Toilers of the East, named for Stalin. Russian acronym KUTVA, Kutva. Otto and I walked into the dormitory a few blocks away, where I was to meet two other black students, Benkel and Farmer. We all immediately took a streetcar to the hospital, which was located on the other side of the Moscow River. There we met with By Golden and some other students, who informed us that Jane Golden had just passed away that morning. Golden seemed to be in a state of shock, and the doctors had given him some sedatives. We went to the hospital morgue to view her body. Benkel broke down in uncontrollable tears. I had learned afterwards that Jane had been a close friend, a kind of a mother to him during the period of adjustment to this new land. We took Golden home to the dormitory. The school collective and its leaders immediately took over the funeral arrangements. The body lay in state in the school auditorium for 24 hours, during which time students thronged past. The funeral was held the following day, and the whole school turned out. The cortege seemed a mile long, and it flowed past Tverskaya towards the cemetery. The students would not allow the casket to be placed upon the cart, but organizing themselves in relays every 50 yards, insisted on carrying it the distance of several miles on their shoulders. A good portion of the American colony in Moscow was assembled at the cemetery. The chairman of the school collective, a young Georgian, delivered a stirring eulogy at the graveside. One of the students who was standing next to me made a running translation, Sorovos, which went something like this. the first among her race to come to the land of socialism, in search of freedom for her oppressed peoples, former slaves, to find out how the Soviets had done it. We were happy to receive her and our comrades. Condolences to her bereaved husband, our comrade Golden, and to the rest of the Negro students. The whole university has suffered a great loss. Rest in peace, Jane Golden. You were with us only a short time, but all of us have benefited from your presence and comradeship. Turning to Golden, he said, we Soviet people and comrades of oppressed colonial and dependent countries must carry on. We pledge our undying support to the cause of your people's freedom. Long live the freedom fight for our Negro brothers in America. Long live the Soviet Union and its Communist Party, beacon of light of the struggle for freedom of all oppressed people. Golden had borne himself well at the graveside, but we didn't want him to return to his room in the students' dormitory, which would only remind him of his grievous loss. So we went to the apartment of MacLeod, an old wobbly friend of ours from Philadelphia, who had attended the funeral and who lived in the Zacharina district across the river. He was a close friend of Big Bill Haywood, and had followed the great working-class leader to the Soviet Union. There we tried to drown our sorrows in good old Russian vodka, which was in plentiful supply. Jane Golden's funeral and the students and the school collective's response to her death made a profound impression on me. Through these events, crammed into the first 3 days of my stay in the Soviet Union, I came to know something about my fellow students and the new socialist society which I had entered. The Bolsheviks' fight for the equality of nations. Kutva was a unique university. At the time I entered, its student body represented more than 70 nationalities and ethnic groups. It was founded by the Bolsheviks for the special purpose of training cadre from the many national and ethnic groups within the Soviet Union, the former colonial dependents of the Tsarist Empire, and also to train cadres from colonial and subject nations outside the Soviet Union. The school was divided into two sections, inner and outer. At the inner sections there were Turkmenis, Uzbeks, Tajiks, Bashkirs, Yakuts, Khalvizhes, Kazakhs, Kalmuks, Buryat Mongols, and inner and outer Mongolians from Soviet Asia. From the Caucasus there were Azerbaijanis, Armenians, Georgians, Abkhazanas, and many other national and ethnic groups I'd never heard of before. There were Tartars from Crimea and the Volga region. The national and ethnic diversity found in the Soviet Union is hard to imagine. The revolution had opened up many areas. For example, through the Trans-Caucasus Road, as late as 1928, existed new groups which were still being, quote-unquote, discovered. These nationalities were all former colonial dependencies of the Tsars and referred to as the Soviet East, the peoples of the East, and borderland countries. The intersection comprised of the main and largest part of the student body in the university. Blacks were, of course, part of the outer section of the school. It included Indians, Indonesians, Koreans, Filipinos, Persians, Egyptians, Arabs, and Palestinian Jews from the Middle East, Arabs from North Africa, Algerians, Moroccans, Chinese, and several Japanese, hardly a colonial people, but as revolutionaries identified with the East. The Chinese, several hundred strong, comprised the largest group of the outer section. This was obviously because China, bordering on the USSR, was in the first stage of its own anti-imperialist revolution, and a revolution receiving direct material and political support from the Soviet Union. While Kutva trained the communist cadre from China, there was also the Sun Yat-sen University just outside Moscow, which trained cadres for the Kuomintang. Among its students was the daughter of the famous Christian general Chiang So-lin. Several Chinese, including Chiang Kai-shek's son, studied in the Soviet military schools during this period. A number of Chinese students from Kutva were massacred by Chiang's troops at the Manchurian border when they returned to China shortly after Chiang's bloody betrayal of the revolution in 1927. Otto told me that a former girlfriend of his was among this group. As I remember, there were no Latin Americans at Kutva during the time I was there, and the sole black African was Bankole. The student body was continually expanding, however, and later included many students from these areas and others. The students studied classic works of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin, but unlike the past schooling we had known, the whole body of theory was related to practice. Theory was not regarded as dogma, but as a guide to action. In May 1925, Stalin had delivered an historic speech at the school, outlining Kutva's purpose and its main task. His lecture was the subject of continuous discussion and study. It was our introduction to Marxist theory on the national question and its development by Lenin and Stalin. How did the Bolsheviks transform a territory embracing 1/6 of the Earth's surface, known as the prison house of nations under the Tsar, into a family of nations, a free union of peoples? What was the policy pursued by the Soviets which enabled them to forge together more than 100 different stages of social development into such an extraordinary unity of effort for the building of a multinational socialist state? The kind of unity that enabled them to win a civil war within and to defeat intervention from 17 nations, including the United States, from without. The starting point for us was to understand that the formation of peoples into nations as an objective law of social development, around which the Bolsheviks, particularly Lenin and Stalin, had developed a whole body of theory. According to this theory, a nation is a historically constituted, stable community of people based on 4 main characteristics: a common territory, a common economic life, a common language, and a common physiological makeup, a national character, manifested in common features of a national culture. Since the development of imperialism, liberation of the oppressed nations had become a question whose final resolution could only come through a proletarian revolution. The guiding principle of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union on the national question was to bring about the unity of laboring masses of various nationalities for the purpose of waging a joint struggle, first to overthrow Tsarism and imperialism, then to build a new society under a working-class dictatorship. The accomplishment of the latter required the establishment of equality before the law of all nationalities, with no special privileges for any one people, and the right of the colonies and subject nations to separate. This principle was incorporated into law of the land of the Declaration of Rights of the People of Russia, passed a few days after the seizure of power by the Bolsheviks. Of course, the declaration itself did not eliminate the national inequality, which, as Stalin had observed, rested on economic inequality, historically formed. To eliminate this historically based economic and cultural inequality imposed by the Tsarist regimes upon the former oppressed nations, it would require that more developed nations assist those formerly oppressed nations and peoples to catch up with the Great Russians in economic and cultural development. In pursuance of this aim, the new government was organized on a bicameral basis. The body was chosen on the basis of population alone. The other, the Council of Nationalities, consisted of the representatives from each of the national territorial units, the autonomous Soviet republics, autonomous regions, and national areas. Any policy in regard to the affairs of these formerly oppressed nations could be carried through with only the approval of the Council of Nationalities. The Communist Party, though its members was involved in both bodies, and worked to see that its policy of full equality and the right to self-determination was implemented. As this theory was put into practice, we learned that the national cultures could be expressed with a proletarian, socialist content, and that there was no antagonistic contradiction under socialism between national cultures and proletarian internationalism. Under the Soviets, languages and other national characteristics of many nationalities were developed and strengthened with the aim of drawing the formerly oppressed nationalities into full participation of the new society. Thus the Bolsheviks upheld the principle of the proletarian in content, national in form. Through this policy, they hoped to draw all nationalities together, acquainting each other with the achievements of the other, leading the truly universal culture, a joint product of all humanity. This is in sharp contrast to imperialism policy of forcibly arresting and distorting the free development of nations in order to maintain their economic and cultural backwardness. As an essential condition for the extraction of superprofits. Thus, the oppressed nations can only achieve liberation only through the path of revolutionary struggle to overthrow imperialism, and in alliance with the working class of the oppressor nations. Stalin, proceeding from the experience and practice of the Soviet Union, emphasized the need for the formation and consolidation of a united revolutionary front between the working class of the West and the rising revolutionary movement from the colonies. A united front based on the struggle against a common enemy, the precondition for forming such unity is that the proletarian and oppressor nations gives direct and determined support to the liberation movement of the oppressed peoples against the imperialism of its own country, for no nation can be free of its oppressors if it oppresses other nations. Engels. This support implies the advocacy, defense, and implementation of the slogan of the right of nations to secession, to independent existence as states. Without this cooperation of peoples based on mutual confidence and fraternal interrelations, it will be impossible to establish the material basis for the victory of socialism. The test of all this theory was being proven in practice in the Soviet Union. The experience of the Bolsheviks demonstrably proved to us that socialism offered the most favorable conditions for the development of oppressed nations and peoples. At the time of the revolution, there were many nationalities within the borders of the Soviet Union in which the characteristics of nationhood had not yet fully matured, and in fact had been suppressed by the Tsars. It was the Soviet system itself which became a powerful factor in the consolidation of these nationalities into nations, as socialist industry and collective farming created the economic basis for this consolidation. I observed this firsthand in Crimea and the Caucasus during my visits there in the summer of 1927 and 28. The languages and culture which had been stifled under the Tsar's regime were now being developed. The language of the Crimean people was a Turco-Tartar language, but before the revolution, almost all education, such as there was in the Russian language. Now there were schools established which used the native language. Otto and other students made similar observations when they traveled to different areas of the Soviet Union. In the meantime, I was having my own problems with the Russian language. On first hearing it, the language sounded most strange to me. I could hardly understand a word, and wondered if I would ever be able to master it. As the youngest Black American, I applied myself seriously to the study. The first hurdle was the Cyrillic alphabet. Its uniquely different characters intimidated me. But the crash course at Kutva, lasting about an hour and a half per day, soon broke down this initial barrier. In addition, I studied on my own for a couple hours each day. I would set out to memorize 20 new words a day. Then at night I would write them out on a sheet of paper and pin them above my mirror in my room. I'd go over them again in the morning while shaving. During the day, I would make sure to use them in conversation with the Russians. English grammar had always seemed irrelevant to me, but I soon came to appreciate the logic of Russian grammar. In fact, I learned most of my English grammar through the study of Russian. Its rules were consistent and understandable. The language soon ceased to be mysterious and revealed itself as a beautifully and simply constructed. In 6 months, I was able to read Pravda with the help of a dictionary. Kutva, structure, and studies. The school structure was fairly complicated, but, as I saw it, thoroughly democratic. There was the collective, the general body, which included everyone in the school, from the rector, faculty, students, clerical, and maintenance workers, to the scrubwoman. The leading body of the collective was the bureau, composed of representatives elected by the various groups in the university. There was also a Communist Party organization, which played the leadership role at all levels. Originally established by the Council of Nationalities, Kutva was now a party school, administered by the Educational Department, Agitprop, of the Central Committee of the CPSU. There was a direct representative of the party, called a party strengthener, in the school administration. Together with the rector and a representative of the students, he was part of the Troika, which constituted the top leadership of the school. Students had the rights of citizens, voting and participating in local elections. The school discussed and dealt with all issues which Soviet workers and peasants discussed at their workplaces. As with all students who pursued courses in higher education in the Soviet Union, we at Kutva received full room and board, clothes, and a small stipend for spending money. There was, of course, no tuition. We used to attend workers' cultural clubs and do volunteer work, like working Saturdays to help build the Moscow subways. Education for us was not an ivory tower, but a true integration into Soviet society, where we received first-hand knowledge from our experiences. The curriculum, which was a 3-year course, was based on Marxism-Leninism, that is, the teachings of Marx and Engels as developed by Lenin. It included dialectical and historical materialism, the Marxist world concept, the Marxist theory of class struggle as the motive force of human events, the economic doctrines of Marxism, value and surplus value, as a key to understanding history by revealing the economic law of motion of modern capitalist societies, Lenin's analysis of imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, theory and tactics of the proletarian revolution and the dictatorship of the proletariat in its Soviet state form, and the problems of socialist construction, Lenin's theory on the peasant question, the alliance of workers and peasants as the base for Soviet power, the national and colonial questions, and the role of the party as a vanguard of the proletariat. We also studied the specific history of the CPSU. Our favorite teacher was Andrei Sik, who taught courses on Leninism and the history of the Soviet Party. Sik was a striking young man. His distinguishing feature was a large shock of white hair, unusual for a man so young. He was probably in his 30s. He was soft-spoken and modest. We all loved Sik. He was an outgoing person who radiated warmth. Sik was a Hungarian, a political refugee living in Russia. He had been a soldier in the Austro-Hungarian army during the First World War. Captured by the Russians, he was converted to Bolshevism while in the Russian prison camp. On his release, he'd gone back to Hungary and participated in the short-lived, 133 days, Hungarian-Soviet government of 1919 of Belakun's. With the defeat of Belakun's government, Sik, along with hundreds of other revolutionaries, fled to the Soviet Union. Hungarian exiles made up one of Moscow's largest foreign colonies. In Moscow, Sik pursued an academic career. He was a graduate of the Institute of Red Professors, and like many Hungarian intellectuals, he was multilingual. For all his good nature, Sik seemed tired and harassed. He was teaching in many schools, in addition to activity in the Hungarian community. 7 years after the defeat of the Hungarian Soviet, the exiled revolutionaries were bitterly divided and fractionalized, laying blame on each other for the failure of the revolution. Sik became deeply interested in the question of blacks in the United States and undertook a serious study of the question. He read all the books available and asked his black students at Kudva to join with him. Unfortunately for our personal relationship, Sik and I would find ourselves on opposite sides of the fence in the discussion of black Americans, which took place at the 6th Congress of the Communist International in June 1928. Our teacher of Marxist economics was a young man by the name of Rubinstein, a Russian economist in the Gosplan, Government Planning Commission. The star pupil of that class had turned out to be our modest friend Golden. Golden, who had known nothing about Marxism before coming to the Soviet Union, was able to grasp the intricacies of Marxist capital and value, price, and profit, seemingly without effort. The class that stands out in my memory was on how to make a revolution, to seize power once the situation was ripe. This course consisted of a series of lectures by a young Red Army officer. He had been a heroic figure in the Moscow uprising of 1917 and the subsequent seizure of power by the Bolsheviks in that city. A tall, handsome man of bourgeois background, he had been a lieutenant in the army of the Kerensky government. Like many other soldiers, he had been won over by the Bolsheviks on the basis of their demands, which reflected the need of the people: peace, bread, and land. To him, the Moscow uprising against Kerensky, led by the Bolsheviks, was a model for the coming seizure of power. In the big cities of the capitalist world, he had a large map of Moscow on the wall, and would use it to illustrate how it had been done. The call for the uprising, he said, had come to the Moscow Communist Party by telephone from Leningrad, where the revolutionary workers, sailors, and army under the leadership of Lenin had overthrown the Kerensky government and seized power in that city. In Moscow, the party organization, already prepared, issued a call to the people for an uprising. His regiment, stationed on the outskirts of the city, together with the Red Guards, workers' militias, responded and began to march towards the center of the city. The White Guardists were concentrated in the Abbot and the Kremlin. Here, he pointed out, in Russian and in other European cities, the working-class districts were centered around factories on the outskirts of the city, and Moscow was circled by workers' suburbs. Together with the defected units of other regiments and with the Red Guards, they marched towards Moscow's central area, whence fighting spread throughout the city, even into the Trans-Moscow district. The Reds finally wiped out the White Guardist strongholds, and the Kremlin, which had changed hand 2 times before in the fighting, finally surrendered. Moscow was ours. Classmates at Kutva. Because of the language problem, we students from outside the Soviet Union were divided into 3 main language groups: English, French, and Chinese. English and French were the dominant languages of the many colonial areas represented at the university. Spanish was later added when Latin American students began to arrive. In addition to ourselves, the English-speaking group included the East Indians, Koreans, Japanese, and Indonesians. I had many close friends in this latter group. One of the most interesting and brilliant was an Indian student by the name of Sakharov. They all took Russian names because of the severe repression they all faced back home. A former machinist in a Detroit auto plant, Sakharov had been sent to the school by the American Party. Originally from Bombay, Sakharov had gone to sea on a British ship at the age of 12 and had been subjected to very oppressive conditions his whole career at sea. He eventually jumped ship in Baltimore and wound up working in an auto plant in Detroit. Of all the group of students, he was the closest to us blacks. He knew firsthand the plight of blacks in the United States, and as a dark-skinned Indian, he had experienced much of the same type of racial abuse while there. After he left the school, he returned to India, where he became one of the founders of the Indian Communist Party. Later, more Indian students were to come, including one 16-year-old, a tall, lanky boy, who took the name Volkov. He had been born in California. His parents were Sikhs who had migrated to the U.S. and worked as agricultural workers in the Imperial Valley of California. They were part of a foreign contingent of the Ghadar Party, a revolutionary nationalist party of Sikhs who had been organized in 1916. The party would pick out young men to be future leaders. Volkov was chosen and sent to Japan for education and stayed there for a year. Then he was sent to study in the Soviet Union, perhaps by the Japanese party. He spoke Japanese and English. Among the Indian students was a group of about half a dozen Sikhs, former professional soldiers, survivors of the Hong Kong massacre of 1926. On the pretext of quelling an imminent mutiny, the British colonel of the regiment stationed in Hong Kong had called the unarmed Sikh soldiers into the regimental square and turned the machine guns on them. All regiments in the Indian Army included a British machine gun company as a safeguard against mutiny. 700 were killed or wounded. As I understood it, the massacre was engineered to quell the protest over conditions which were being raised by members of the Ghadar Party and its supporters. The group who arrived in Moscow were among the few who escaped over the walls. They had fled to Shanghai, where they were taken in charge by M.N. Roy, an Indian and then Comintern representative to China. Roy sent them to Moscow. These students, some of them older gray-bearded men, had spent their whole lives in the British Indian Army. They represented a special problem for the school because most of them had very little education of any kind. They were not brought into our class, but were put into a special group under the tutelage of Volkov, Sakharov, and other of the regular Indian students. It was my good fortune to meet many of these Indian students again in 1942, when I was in Bombay as a merchant marine. Most of them were leading figures in the Indian revolutionary movement. Sakharov had been a defendant in one of the Muir trials, having been charged with the conspiracy against the king. Since his return to India, he had spent 11 years in prison. Nada, among another former schoolmate, was president of the Indian Friends of the Soviet Union and very active among the students and youth. There were several Koreans and Japanese at the school, 2 Indonesians. I remember Drija particularly well, a Dutch-educated Indonesian intellectual. He was an old revolutionary who spent many years in prison. There was another Indonesian, a young man, whose name I cannot recall, who later emerged as a communist leader and was killed in the Indonesian Revolt of 1946. Kemal Pasha, a party name conferred on him by Sakharov, was a great-eyed Moroccan from the Rifin tribe of Abdul Karim. I met Kemal Pasha again in Paris during the Spanish Civil War. There were also 2 whites in the group, June Kroll, then the wife of an American communist leader, Karl Reeves, and Max Half, and a young English lad of Russian Jewish parentage. Blacks in Moscow. We students were a fairly congenial lot, and, in particular, I got to know the other black students quite well. Golden was a handsome, jet-black man, a former Tuskegee student, and a dining car waiter. He was not a member of the Communist Party, but he was a good friend of Levitt Fort Whiteman, head of the party's Afro-American work. Golden told me that his coming to the Soviet Union had been accidental. He had run into Fort Whiteman, a fellow student at Tuskegee, on the streets of Chicago. Fort Whiteman had just returned from Russia and was dressed in a Russian blouse and boots. As Golden related it, I asked Fort Whiteman what the hell he was wearing. Had he come off the stage and forgotten to change clothes? He informed me that these were all Russian clothes, and that he had just returned from that country. Golden at first thought it was a put-on, but became interested as Fort Whiteman talked about his experiences. Then, out of the blue, he asked me if I wanted to go to Russia as a student. At first I thought he was kidding, but man, I would have done anything to get off those dining cars. I was finally convinced that he was serious. But I'm married, I told him. What about my wife? Why, bring her along too, he replied. He took me to his office at the American Negro Labor Congress, an impressive step up with the secretary, and I was convinced. Fort Whiteman gave me money to get passports. Next thing I knew, a couple of weeks later, we were on a boat with Otto and others on the way to Russia. And here I am now. He had a keen sense of humor and kidded the rest of us lot, particularly Otto. His southern accent carried over into Russian, and we teased him about being the only person who spoke Russian with a Mississippi accent. There was Benkol, an African who spent most of his time with the black Americans. He was an Ashanti from the Gold Coast, now Ghana, and his family was part of the African elite. Son of a wealthy barrister, his family had sent him to London University to study journalism. From there, he had gone to Carnegie Tech in Pittsburgh. He had been on the road to becoming a perennial student and had planned to continue at McGill University in Montreal, but was recruited to the Young Communist League in Pittsburgh. In the States, he was confronted with a racism more blatant than any he had met before. I gathered that it struck him sharply, and he had been largely responsible for his move to the left. My brother Otto had become sort of a character in the school. He was popular among the students, who immediately translated his pseudonym, Jim Jones, into Russian, Ivan Ivanish. Otto had absolutely no tolerance for red tape, and had become the mortal enemy of the apparatchiki, petty bureaucrats, in the school. He had built a reputation for making their lives miserable, and when they saw him coming, they were huddled in a corner. Here comes Ivan Ivanovich. Ostorojon, watch out. Dosho skande vodiet. This guy will make a big scandal. Harold Williams of Chicago was a West Indian and former seaman in the British Merchant Marine. He had adopted the name of Dessalines, one of the three leaders of the Haitian Revolution of 1790s. Williams had little formal education and some difficulty in grasping theory, but was instinctively a class-conscious guy. Finally, there was Mahoney, whose name in the USSR was Jim Farmer. Farmer was a steel worker from East Liverpool, Ohio, a Communist Party member, and had played a leading role in the local struggles in the steel mills. There were only 8 of us blacks in a city of 4.5 million people. In addition to the 6 students, there were also 2 black American women who had long residence since before the revolution in Moscow. I only knew of one of these women, Emma Harris. We first met on the occasion on the death of Jane Golden. Emma was a warm, outgoing, and earthly middle-aged woman, originally from Georgia. It was evident that she had been quite handsome, of the type of that in the old days we called a tease and brown. Emma had first come to Moscow as a member of a black song and dance group, a lowly hoofer in the world of cheap vaudeville. Having been deserted by its manager, the group was left stranded in Moscow. While others had evidently made their way back to the States, Emma had decided to stay. She had liked the country. Here, being black wasn't a liability, but on the contrary, a definite asset. With her drive and ambition to be somebody, Emma parlayed this asset into a profitable position. She married a Russian who installed her, it seems, as a madam of a house of prostitution. It was no ordinary house, she explained to me. Our clients were wealthy and nobility. To the former hoofer, this was status. Such was Emma's situation in November 1917, when the Russian Bolsheviks and Red Guards moved in from the proletarian suburbs of Moscow to capture the bourgeois inner city and the Kremlin. During some mopping up operations, Emma's house was raided by the Cheka, the security police. A bunch of white guards had holed up there, and the whole group was arrested, including Emma. They were taken to Lubyanka prison, and some of the more notorious white guards were summarily executed. Emma remained in a cell for a few days. Finally, she was called up before a Czech official. He told her that they were looking into her case. Many of the people who had been arrested at her place were counter-revolutionaries and conspirators against the new Soviet Union, and some had been shot. Emma disclaimed knowledge of any conspiracy and stated that she was engaged in legitimate business and had nothing to do with the politics of her clients. "You know, the only reason we didn't shoot you was because you are a Negro woman," said the official. To her surprise, he added, "You are free to go now. I advise you to find some useful work. Keep out of trouble." When we met Emma, she had become a textile worker. She lived with a young Russian woman, also a textile worker, whom I suspected was a reformed prostitute, in a two-room apartment in the old working-class district near Krasnaya Vorota, Red Gate. Soon after the first black students arrived, she sought them out and greeted them like long-lost kinfolk. At least once a month, we students would pool part of the sum of stipends we received and give Emma the money to shop for and prepare some old home cooking for us. On these occasions, she would regale us stories from her past life. At times, she could detect a fleeting expression of sadness, of nostalgia for her old days of affluence. She could see that she had never become fully adjusted to life under the new Soviets. While not openly hostile, it was clear that she was not an ardent partisan of the new regime. Knowing our sentiments, she avoided political discussion and kept her views to herself. Our feelings towards her were warmest when we first arrived, but as we developed more ties with the Russians, we went by to see her less often. But we did continue to visit her periodically. She was sort of a mother figure for us, and we all felt sorry for her. She was getting old, and it often expressed a desire to return to the States. She was finally able to return home after World War II. Needless to say, blacks attracted the curiosity of Muscovites. Children followed us in the streets. If we paused to greet a friend, we found ourselves instantly surrounded by curious crowds, unabashedly staring at us. Once while strolling down Tverskaya, Otto and I stopped to greet a white American friend, and immediately found ourselves surrounded by curious Russians. It was friendly curiosity, which we took in stride. A young Russian woman stepped forward and began to upbraid and lecture the crowd. "Why are you staring at these people? They're human beings the same as us. Do you want them to think we're savages? Etne kulturana, that is uncultured." The last was an epithet, and in these days, a high insult. Etenet pro-Sovietinsky, it's not the Soviet way. She scolded them. At that point, someone in the crowd calmly responded, "Well, citizenness, it's a free country, isn't it?" We were not offended, but amused. We understood this for what it was. There was one occasion when Otto Farmer Bankole and I were walking down Tverskaya. Bankole, of course, stood out, attracting more attention than the rest of us, with his English-cut Savile Row suit, monocle, cane, a black edition of a British aristocrat. We found ourselves being followed by a group of Russian children who shouted, "Jazz band, jazz band." Otto and Farmer and I were amused at the incident and took it in stride. Bankole, however, shaking with rage at the implication, jerked around to confront them. His monocle fell off as he shouted, "Net jazzband, net jazzband." As he spoke, he hit his cane on the ground for emphasis. Evidently, to these kids, a jazz band was not just a group of musicians, but a race or tribe of people to which we must belong. They obviously thought we were with Leyland and Drayton, the musicians I had met in Berlin. They had been a big hit with the Muscovites. We pulled Bankole away. "Come on, man, cut it out. They don't mean anything." In the Soviet Union, remnants of national and racial prejudices from old society were attacked by education and law. It was a crime to give or receive direct or indirect privileges, or to exercise discrimination because of race or nationality. Any manifestation of racial or national superiority was punishable by law, and was regarded as a serious political offense, a social crime. During my entire stay in the Soviet Union, I encountered only one instance of racial hostility. It was on a Moscow streetcar. Several of us black students had boarded the car on our way to spend an evening with our friend McLeod. It was after rush hour, and the car was only half filled with Russian passengers. As usual, we were objects of friendly curiosity. At one stop, a drunken Russian staggered aboard. Seeing us, he muttered, but loud enough for the whole car to hear, something about black devils in our country. A group of outraged Russian passengers thereupon seized him and ordered the motorman to stop the car. It was a citizen's arrest, the first I'd ever witnessed. How dare you, you scum, insult people who are guests in our country? What then occurred was an impromptu, on-the-spot meeting, where they debated on what to do with the man. I was to see many this kind of meeting during my stay in Russia. It was then decided to take the culprit to the police station, which, the conductor informed them, was a few blocks ahead. Upon arrival, they hustled the drunk out of the car and insisted that we blacks, as injured parties, come along to make the charges. At first we demurred, saying that the man was obviously drunk and was not responsible for his remarks. "No, citizens," said a young man who had done most of the talking. "Drunk or not, we don't allow this sort of thing in our country. You must come with us to the militia police station and prefer charges against this man." The car stopped in front of the station. The poor drunk was hustled off, and all the passengers came along. The defendant had sobered up somewhat about this time and began apologizing before we had even entered the building. We got to the commandant of the station. The drunk swore that he didn't mean what he said. I was drunk and angry about something else. I swear to you, citizens, that I have no racial prejudice against this black gospoda, gentlemen. We actually felt sorry for this poor fellow, and we accepted his apology. We didn't want to press the matter. "No," said the commandant. "We'll keep him overnight. Perhaps this will teach a lesson to him." Big Bill Haywood. In addition to the students at Kutva and the two black women, there was a sizable American colony in Moscow during my stay there. There were political representatives of the Communist Party USA to the Comintern, the Profintern, the Crescentern, and to the departments, bureaus, secretaries of these organizations, holding jobs as translators, stenographers, and researchers. Soviet cultural and publishing organizations also employed U.S. citizens, in addition to the political groups. There were a number of technical and skilled workers who came as specialists to work for the new Soviet state. I got to know a number of these Americans during my stay, both official reps and others in the colony. Big Bill Haywood was perhaps the most famous of these. He was an organizer and founder of the IWW and a great friend of all blacks in Moscow. At the time I met him, he was in his late 50s and quite ill, suffering from diabetes. Physically, he was only the shell of the man he had once been. He had called himself a political refugee from American capitalism. As a sick man, he had fled the U.S. to avoid a 10-year frame-up prison sentence, which he knew he would never have survived. Bill was blind in one eye, which he overwore with black eye patch. I had imagined the loss of the eye had happened in a fight with company or police thugs, and was rather disappointed to learn that it was a result of a childhood accident. In the Soviet Union, he had participated in the organization of the Kuzbass colony. The project was to reopen and operate the industry in the Kuzenskin Basin in the Urals, closed during the Civil War period. The colony was located about 1,000 miles from Moscow, in an area of enormous coal deposits, vital to socialist industrialization. The district, with its mines and deserted chemical plants, had been established by the Soviet government as an autonomous colony. Big Bill brought a number of American skilled workers, many of whom were old wobblies, to reopen the plants and mines. Big Bill had become a member of the CPUSA at its founding convention in 1921, and while the Soviet Union, he was a member of the CPUSU. Bill and his devoted wife, a Russian office worker, lived in the Lux Hotel, a Comintern hostelry. His room had become the center of the gathering of the American radicals, especially old wobblies passing through or working in the Soviet Union. They would gather on Sunday night and reminisce about the old times and discuss current problems. Often a bunch of us black students were present. Sometimes these sessions would carry on all night until Sunday morning. There were only a few chairs in the room, and Bill would sit in a huge armchair surrounded by people sitting on the floor. For us blacks, listening to Big Bill was like a course on the American labor movement. He was a bitter enemy of racism, which he saw as the mainstay of capitalism dominion over the U.S. working class, a continuous break on labor unity. This attitude was reflected in the preamble of the IWW Constitution, he told us. It read, "No working man or woman shall be excluded from membership in unions because of creed or color." This was borne out in practice. The IWW was the first labor organization in modern times to invade the South and break down the racial barriers in that benighted region. He recounted his experiences in the organizing drives among Southern lumber workers in Louisiana and Texas. This resulted in the organization of the Brotherhood of Timber Workers in 1910, an independent union in the lumber camps of Louisiana, Texas, and Arkansas. At its height, the union had 25,000 members, half of them black. Bill Burke described how the IWW broke down discrimination at the first convention of this union. He had come from the National IWW office to speak at the convention. They were all white, he said, and he had inquired why no colored men were present. He was told that the Louisiana state law prohibited meeting of black and white, the Negro brothers, that were meeting in another hall nearby. Bill recalled that he told them, "Damn the law. It's the law of the lumber bosses. Its objective is to defeat you and to keep you divided. You're not going to get anywhere by obeying the dictates of the bosses. You've got to meet together." And the latter did exactly that, he told us. I remember that a few days after one of these gatherings, we telephoned him to tell him that we were coming over, only to learn that from his wife that he had had a stroke and was in the Kremlin hospital. She said that he was getting along okay, but couldn't see visitors. After several weeks, he returned home. Still weak, he received many friends and many of the delegates to the Fourth Congress of the Profintern, which was in Moscow at the time. Big Bill was the leading participant in this organization since its inception. Then suddenly he was back in hospital, where he died on May 18, 1928. The whole American colony turned out for his funeral. There were delegations from the Russian Communist Party, of which he was still a member, and from the various international organizations from which he had played a role. The Fourth Congress of the RILU adjourned its sessions, and representatives of trade unions from all over the world attended the funeral. I'm sure for us black students, our meeting and friendship with this great man were among the most memorable experiences of our stay in Moscow. A stalwart son of the American working class, Bill's life and battles represented the best traditions. To blacks, he was a man who could not only stand up with you, but if need be, go down with you. This was the iron test in the fight against the common enemy, U.S. capitalism. Big Bill obviously understood from his own experiences the truth of the Marxian maxim that in the U.S., labor in the white skin can never be as free as long as in the black it is branded. Ina. I first met my second wife, Ekaterina, or Ina, in December 1926. We were both at a party in the home of Rose Bennett, a British woman who had married M. Petrovsky Bennett, the chairman of the Anglo-American Commission of the Comintern and formerly CI representative to Great Britain. Ina was one of a group of ballet students whom Rose had invited to meet us Kutva students. She was a small young woman of 19 or 20, shy, retiring, and sat off removed from the party. After that party we met several times, and she told me about herself. She was born in Vladikavkaz in northern Caucasus, the daughter of the mayor of the town. It was one of those towns that was taken and retaken during the Civil War, one time by the Whites and then by the Reds. On one occasion when the whole town fell to the Reds, her father was accused of collaborating with the Whites. The Reds came and arrested him, and she never saw him again. Ina was 11 at the time. She later learned that her father had been executed. Her uncle was a famous artist in Moscow, and after her father's execution, they went to live there. Ina told me of the trip to Moscow at the height of the famine and typhus epidemic. They rode in freight cars several days through Ukraine and saw people dying along the road. Her uncle took charge of them and got them an apartment on Malaya Bronyaya. He investigated the case of her father and discovered that a mistake had been made, and her father was posthumously exonerated. As sort of a compensation, she and her mother were regarded as social activists, and Ina entered school to study ballet. She later transferred from ballet school to study English in preparation for her work as a translator. We lived together in the spring of 1927 and got married the following fall after my return from Crimea. In January 2017, I was stunned by the news of the death of my mother. One morning, I was in Ina's house. Otto's burst in, overcome by emotion. He could hardly talk, but managed to blurt out, "Mom's dead." He had a letter from her sister Eppa, with a clipping of Mother's obituary from the Chicago Defender. Under the headline, "Funeral of Miss Harriet Hall," was her picture and an article which described her, a domestic worker, as a noted clubwoman. She had been a member of the Black Eastern Star and several other lodges and burial societies. The article mentioned that she was survived by her husband, daughter, and 2 sons, the latter in Moscow. I was overcome with grief and guilt at not being home. Deeply shocked, I had always assumed that I would return to see Mother again. Born a slave, her world had been confined to the Midwest and Upper South. She had once told me, "Son, I would like to see the ocean," and I had glibly promised, "Oh, I'll take you there someday, Mama." I felt that I had been her favorite. I was the responsible one, and yet I hadn't been able to do what I had promised. Worse yet, I wasn't even there when she died. It took me some time to get over the shock. End of Chapter 5 of Black Bolshevik. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Book Club Commune. Before I leave today, I just want to tell everyone to stay safe out there. It's currently 2 days after the election has happened, and it's already looking like there's going to be militia, Trumpist, fascist militia, rampaging, QAnon shit. It's all looking really fucking bad right now. So I just want to make sure everyone stay safe, be careful, and organize and stay together. Oh, also, if you're trying to reach out to me personally, Twitter has deleted my Twitter account because I told @neoliberal that I was going to goat slit his eyes. So yeah, if you want to talk to me, you can find me at prol_Carikope, CARIKOPE on Twitter. It should say a victim of Kautskyism, as all of us are. That's all I have to say today. Solidarity, and keep on reading.